Kia ora koutou. Hi, everyone. My name is Siobhán, and I'm part of the health psychology team at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm working as the postdoctoral fellow on this research project on menstruation tracking apps. So in this video, I'm going to share the presentation that I gave at the International Society of Critical Health Psychology conference in 2025, which was entitled "It Just Adds More Fuel to the Weak Woman Fire, Perimenopausal Excuses, Feminist Dilemmas, and the Politics of Menstruation Tracking Apps." So to begin, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and give a bit of background to the overall project. So the focus of the wider project is on menstruation tracking apps because they are not a neutral technology. They shape users' understandings of their bodies and their identities. And this is of particular interest to us as critical health psychologists because many users are not that imagined prototypical user of a cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, slim white woman who is managing fertility. And these apps are also not neutral in the sense that they imagine a stable body as the norm, even though we know that most menstruators' experiences are characterized by change and irregularity. So our project is looking at the experiences of people who don't fit that imagined menstruation tracking app user. And that's in terms of experiencing changes in their bodies at particular life stages. So those who are experiencing perimenopause, people who are post-pregnancy, and teenagers who are getting used to their menstruating body. So what we might call these disruptive life stages and stages of life that tracking app developers are not necessarily considering or don't have front of mind. So our focus is on people who are in these life stages, but we're also interested in speaking with folks who identify with some of these groups that are listed here, who are typically underrepresented or marginalized in research in general, and again, who are not that kind of imagined prototypical app user. So today I'm presenting on the data that's generated with the perimenopause cohort. And we collected this data through 10 cooperative inquiry groups that were carried out with 24 diverse users of menstruation tracking apps from across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they were all held over Zoom. So cooperative inquiry is a small group action research method where similarly identified people collaboratively explore issues of mutual concern over time. So in our study, each of the 10 groups met somewhere between 3 to 5 times, which really allows discussions and conversation to evolve and to deepen over several sessions. These groups also operate on what we call an action reflection cycle. So at the end of each session, group members will decide on a particular action that they want to take, and then they will explore that over the following 2 weeks. And then when we reconvene, we discuss what it was like to engage with that action. So for example, some participants wanted to track more, or they wanted to stop tracking completely, wanted to look at terms and conditions, wanted to try out different apps. There was lots of different actions that groups took. Okay, so that's a bit about the project overall. And within that then, I was particularly interested in exploring how does feminism shape perimenopausal participants' meaning making in relation to menstruation tracking apps? And I think this question is particularly interesting because recently perimenopause has gained a kind of new visibility in public discourse. And that's been really facilitated by celebrity advocacy, such as Davina McCall in the UK, and in New Zealand, for example, where two major books on menopause were published in 2019. And this visibility is potentially cause for optimism among feminists because we now have these long marginalized experiences that are finally being named and discussed. And yet at the same time, with this new visibility and renewed discourse, some tensions arise within that because This idea of Western or liberal feminism really cautions that to recognize a biological difference is to risk reproducing essentialist discourses that stigmatize perimenopausal experiences. So, this new visibility of perimenopause, while often having a feminist framing in terms of recognizing perimenopausal experiences in public discourse, typically connects to more neoliberal discourses that encourage individualized and commercialized solutions that are related to self management and embodied control, and that have received significant critique within feminist literature. So, within this space and context, then we have menstruation tracking apps, which are marketed as tools of empowerment for managing menstruation, some of which have specific perimenopause functions. So this is really the background context that we are working from. So for the rest of the presentation, then I'm going to look at how participants, perimenopausal participants, described the feminist dilemmas that have emerged from this particular context and their experiences of using technology in an attempt to mediate these dilemmas. So, given our interest in how participants navigate and resist dominant discourses of femininity, health, and aging, we use feminist post-structuralism to frame our analytical approach. So, we were particularly interested in the macro conflicting discourses that provide the conditions of possibility for the discursive construction of particular dilemmas, and the lack of alternative discourses that offer tenable or livable subject positions. So all that's to say we were really interested in the feminist dilemmas that feel they cannot be resolved because of these large, powerful discourses. And we were interested specifically then in the way that these apps, the menstruation tracking apps, mediate subjectivity. So here I've outlined how existing competing discourses were mobilized to produce two related discursive dilemmas. So, dilemma one, resisting the hysterical woman discourse while acknowledging the embodied realities of perimenopause. And dilemma two, turning to menstruation tracking apps to make sense of the embodied realities of perimenopause, only to encounter new forms of exclusion and discipline. So I'm going to talk you through how the first unresolvable dilemma produces the second unresolvable dilemma. So in this first dilemma, participants were resistant to the essentialized discourses that related to the historical, monstrous, hormone-fueled woman. And yet at the same time, many participants described experiencing really challenging embodied perimenopausal experiences. So, two interesting subject positions were produced in this context. There was the no time for excuses feminist and the failed feminist subject position. So, for example, here Mabel says, I've had colleagues say to me, oh, I'm sorry, it's just my menopausal brain. And I swear that really pisses me off. I'm like, girl, it's not your menopausal brain. It's you being a lazy ass, like. And also, if I can do it, so can you. I think because feminist wise, it's like, I don't know, it just adds more fuel to the weak woman fire, I guess. I've heard some people say, oh, well, that's just menopause brain, or that's just menopause. And like that's been used as an excuse, and that really annoys me. So here we see how the no time for excuses feminist subject position works to reject the hysterical discourse by rejecting challenging embodied experiences, by ultimately rejecting menopause brain. But at the same time, the failed feminist subject position is produced here, whereby those who vocalize their embodied struggles with perimenopause are positioned as undermining the cause of liberal feminism, because feminist wise, they should be ignoring the body and supporting the notion that women can do it all. So, in this dilemma, then, the question is how can feminist identified perimenopausal people advocate for compassion and accommodations given their changing bodies without reifying the essentialist discourses that have traditionally worked to subjugate women? So, to exit this dilemma and really difficult space, participants turned to menstruation tracking apps as a solution, orienting to the technology's promise of bodily control through self knowledge. But this created a different, unresolvable dilemma. Turning to menstruation tracking apps to make sense of the embodied reality of perimenopause meant that they encountered new forms of exclusion and discipline. So, the promise here is that tracking and accumulating enough data can lead to some kind of control over perimenopause, despite perimenopause being defined by irregularity and change. So, when participants described using their apps to make sense of their bodies, one way they encountered this discipline and ultimate harm was through the burden of self care. So, here Sadie describes tracking as self care. She says, self care is just one more thing that women have to do, like one more thing on the list that we have to do for ourselves. I don't want to do my self care anymore. Somebody else can do my self care. Oh my God. But if I get out of my childish brain, my child brain, it's yeah, this is what I do to look after myself. This is part of valuing my own body and my own system. So we can read her description here as a critique of post feminist self care discourse as faux feminist. It's supposedly self care, but it's just one more thing that women have to do. And this is really disciplinary power in action in the way that she is mobilizing a post feminist care discourse, but she can feel its truth as self regulation and surveillance. The dilemma then for these good self caring subjects like Sadie is the tension in understanding the apps as labor or as a genuine and legitimate act of care of the self. So, in turning to the tracking apps to try and make sense of their embodied experiences, it becomes a case of to be a good feminist, one needs to take care of oneself through tracking, creating this burden of self care. Continuing with dilemma two, then, part of the appeal of turning to menstruation tracking apps to make sense of the embodied realities of perimenopause was their promise of credibility through real data, that they could mediate interactions with healthcare professionals. But this tracking labor was often dismissed within androcentric and stigmatizing health systems. So here's an exchange between two participants, Sienna and Sadie. What would that be like to not have to like fight for kind of every scrap of credibility when it comes to our own health by having to keep these logbooks of information that reveal patterns in order to show, to prove to our doctors that we're worth more than just here's a new script for Panadol, but not too much because then you must be neurotic. So here we see how the broader context of endemic epistemic injustice in the healthcare system shapes engagement with menstruation tracking, where you need real data, not personal experience, to take to your healthcare professional to gain credibility. And to do that, you need to do the labor, consistently log, and bring it to them. But this labor is undertaken in the face of patriarchal healthcare, so that they might just be taken seriously. And at the same time, the risk is that tracking too much positions you as a neurotic or an otherwise problematic patient. So, what is the right amount of tracking? It seems that, as in post feminist culture in general, it's just impossible to get it right. And by using these apps, these particular participants became folded into another set of problematic positions. So, overall, in this current moment, it seems that perimenopausal people are in a bind. Alongside the feminist imperative to make change and raise awareness, there's also a feminist demand to remain silent about challenging embodied changes and to mask any emotional fallout of perimenopause for fear of being reduced to only hormones or less capable than their male colleagues, for example. So I therefore conclude by asking, how might we develop a feminist lexicon that accounts for the commercial logics and biologically reductive borders of menstruation tracking apps and the androcentric often uncaring world perimenopausal people navigate. So thanks for listening, and feel free to get in touch with questions or comments at the email address listed here.